In this lecture, we're looking at the Enlightenment in the context of the 17th century. And if there's any subject that is hotly contested in terms of the interpretation of this day and age, it is the origins and the impact of the Enlightenment. Anyone standing in the modern world, of course, knows about something called the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. We live in a world where often the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment itself is pitted against claims of faith, claims of theology, or these kinds of things. Often from the modern vantage, it seems like this seamless shift from the rise of the Enlightenment until its flowering and eventually its culmination in the modern world. And needless to say, the Enlightenment had a dramatic impact on everything from culture to politics to the church and eventually to technology. The issue, though, here is always one of interpretation. Depending on which historian or which historical group you happen to read, you're going to hear different origin stories as to who brought about the Enlightenment. Some see it beginning as early as 1650, which is the century that we're in right now during these next several lectures. Others see it as arising in the 1700s or the next century. Still others, though a minority report on the subject, see it as a process that goes back to the Greco-Roman period that lay dormant during the age of the Middle Ages and, of course, during the Reformation, but which here in the early modern period begins to rise again to the ascendancy. The problem is only compounded, though, when you start to look around for what is the central, you might say, philosophical or intellectual commitment of anyone in the Enlightenment. Some see it as mere doubt, maybe a commitment to not merely taking questions on the authority of the Bible or of the church. Others see it as part and parcel to the scientific revolution, advances in technology and these kinds of things that appear to wipe away the sense of mystery and awe and of miracles. Or maybe, depending on, again, the interpretation, the Enlightenment itself is the erosion of confidence in the Christian faith itself, and what's left is something that is altogether rational. Well, there's a word often used by historians that we want to avoid here, and the word is Whiggish. The Whiggish perspective on history is a common claim that's often used by historians. Whenever we have a sort of manifest destiny, always marching towards progress view of history, the Whiggish perspective on any number of different things is often the claim that those who are the victors eventually rewrite the history to look like their predecessors were always there from the beginning. And the Whigs, of course, are a political movement within the English context, who are in favor of liberal thought, rationalism, democracy, and these kinds of things. And it was often the case that whenever someone with a Whiggish bent began to write the history of either England or some other thing, it always seemed like the great march throughout history down until their own day, when everything was now hunky-dory. Well, we want to avoid this because what it tends to do when you are a Whig, whenever you have a Whiggish understanding of history, is you always read things as clear-cut distinctions, fast breaks, and any evidence to the contrary always gets explained away. Instead, what we want to talk about here in this first lecture on the Enlightenment is just how it got going. What were its impulses? What did those in the 17th century who were part of this movement of what would eventually become known as the Enlightenment, what did they think they were doing? And what were their instincts? And the definition of the Enlightenment we're going to go with here is that the Enlightenment, in the context of the 17th century, is a revolution, and it's a revolution of ideas and practices related to all types of levels of society: politics, culture, the arts, philosophy, theology. But, and this is the important thing, these early days of the Enlightenment were neither self-consciously a break with the past, and more importantly, they always tend to vary across time and space. You have folks who are essentially Christian and overtly Protestant, who get wrapped up in what would become known as the Enlightenment, but who themselves were not really on board with what would become the Enlightenment project of the separation of faith and reason. You also have folks who are more radical or less radical during these decades of the 17th century. The key, though, is that as there is a revolution, as there is a renewed vigor of certain questions and the questioning of certain key assumptions. At times, the revolution is only understood piecemeal. Those who are part of the early scientific revolution, for example, men like Francis Bacon, who we're going to look at here in a minute, was really the furthest thing from what the Enlightenment would eventually become. He is very much a theologian who is concerned about science, or a Christian man who is attempting to apply his Christian principles to the study of the natural world. He is hardly an atheist who eventually, through the process of science or doubt or criticism, eventually leaves the faith. In other words, some are embracing a revolution or a renewed interest in ideas or science or doubt even. But they're doing so, they think, from the context of their faith, and they themselves don't embrace the revolution as it would come to be known later. So therefore, the implications of what they're doing are either things that they are unaware of, or in some cases, later implications during the Enlightenment are things that these early Enlightenment thinkers might not have gone along with. The goal of anyone during this revolution, again, of the Enlightenment during the early days, would of course not have seen themselves principally as starting a new movement. Many of them saw themselves as reformers, going back to the old way of doing things. But they do introduce new categories and new discussions, as we'll see, that do have a collateral impact as the decades and eventually as the centuries wear on. The key issue for a lot of folks during this day and age is the grounding of the Christian faith and of philosophy and other things towards a commitment of progress and tolerance. Now, this will eventually lead to a quest for freedom, in particular the revolutionary freedom ideas that we see in the next century during the revolutionary era, with the French Revolution and the American Revolution and so on. In this day and age, though, again, coming out of the wars of religion, coming out of the real deep hostility between Protestants and Catholics, you see the intelligentsia, as we call them, the leading intellectual leaders of Europe, beginning in part to have to reckon with the fact that the claims to total truth, to being the one church over all, flies in the face of the fact that their neighbors are now, let's say, Protestant. Now, we don't want to make too much of this. I find it actually quite striking how people describe the religious tussling back and forth from the 17th century in the context of the modern world. Too often, for example, when we're talking about the Puritans or about the Pilgrims coming to the New World, it's often described as being their desire to, quote, practice their own religion in their own way. Well, the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism, while certainly great on a number of key areas, hardly constitutes the practicing of a different religion entirely. These are not ethnically cleansed, oppressed people leaving a world where their faith itself is being destroyed. Rather, it's the practice of their, we might say, denominational distinction that is causing them to want to leave. Well, again, repeatedly in these early days of the Enlightenment, those who are part of the intelligentsia throughout Europe are trying to find ways to engage in the intellectual world and in the theological world or the philosophical world in a way that would ground or reground the commitments of the Europeans to the truth, but in a way that would allow them to make room, let's say, so that there does not need to continue on so much war and bloodshed for the sake of faith. The key issue here, though, is that those living in the 17th century, in particular in the mid-1600s, are not themselves part of what we would later call the radical Enlightenment. Here's the thing. These folks living in the 17th century are not going to be all that radical when we look back on it from where the Enlightenment will eventually go. However, when we get into the next century, into the 18th century, those who are more radically opposed to the things of faith entirely in and of themselves, or even those who might be considered deist or atheist during the 18th century, will look back on the 17th century and claim some of these figures as their forefathers. In particular, we'll see the person of Voltaire. Voltaire loves to look back and to rewrite some of the history and claim certain people as part of his more robust, you might say cynical, anti-religious way of approaching the intellectual life. Voltaire was great at mockery, and he was also great at revisionist history. It's Voltaire, for example, who looks back on the humanists of the Catholic world coming from the Middle Ages into the Reformation. And he claims that he is a humanist, that humanism really means what he is all about. Never mind that the early humanists were all devout Catholic, and with only a few exceptions were all, frankly, Orthodox Catholic. Yet Voltaire rewrites the humanist story as being part of his heritage, and therefore the early humanists were all men like him. Well, he does the same thing here in the 17th century when he's looking back at men like Francis Bacon and others, and he claims them as part of his own perspective. Well, for the sake of historical record, we do need to point out that this is, again, a revisionist reading of these things. So what we want to do here is be careful. In the 17th century, there are those who are certainly part of the Enlightenment, and they are certainly changing some of the categories. However, it's the following century, the 18th century, that sparks what we call the radical Enlightenment, and they therefore retell some of this story as being a bit different than what actually occurred in the context of history. Last little bit of house cleaning here, we need to dispel really 3 myths. These are the 3 myths that are related to the early Enlightenment in particular, that we need to make sure we understand and distance just a bit from the Enlightenment as it will come to be known. First myth, not everything in the Enlightenment is about freedom. Again, looking in the modern world back, we tend to say, well, the Enlightenment comes along and they preach freedom of thought first, and then eventually freedom in the political arena and the brotherhood of men and the equality of all people. Well, that kind of flies in the face that so many oppressive things were going on during this day that were not only buttressed by religious claims, but even within the context of the Enlightenment. Things like slavery, the African slave trade in particular, hierarchical distinctions between the peasant folks or the lay folks and those who were of the elite status of Europeans, were not destroyed at all. In fact, in many cases, they were not even attacked. And this is particularly the case when you look at the slave trade. So many of these so-called Enlightenment freedom fighters are really fighting for freedom for themselves. In other words, the Enlightenment is a time of freedom, relatively speaking, from the Middle Ages. But this is still an age where it's freedom for some and not for everybody. Secondly, the Enlightenment is not the first generation to exclusively discuss the issue of faith and reason. The Enlightenment should not be seen as merely the question of unaided or superior reason rising up to challenge the questions of faith. That is certainly part of the Enlightenment, but when you actually take a wider look at history, the entirety of the Middle Ages, by and large, when you look at the subject of scholasticism, churned back and forth on the question of the limits of reason and the expression of faith. There are figures in the Middle Ages who come almost entirely to the same conclusions, though with different applications, sure, about the role of reason in the context of the intellectual life. Abelard, for example, though he is challenged on a number of different fronts, was a man who believed that reason and faith were virtually synonymous, so that if something was not provable by reason, well, so much the worse for that idea. In some ways, Abelard looks very much like an Enlightenment man, and he's not the only one. Similarly, there are those within these early decades of the Enlightenment, like Descartes, who we'll look at here in a second, who actually looks back to this same medieval period as the wellspring of at least the concepts that he is discussing. Descartes, for example, points explicitly to Anselm's ontological argument for God as part of the foundation for his own thinking about reason and about doubt. So you cannot say that every age, every century before the Enlightenment was simply blind faith, superstitious nonsense in and of itself. The European world and its heritage from the Greco-Roman world, and in particular from Aristotle, had always wrestled with the question of where does our reason begin or end, and where does something like faith take over? So the Enlightenment is not simply rationalism replacing superstition. Rather, it's a reapplication of some of these older debates, and certainly it is a different departure, as we'll see. But the Enlightenment is not merely rationalism over against faith. Rather, it's an application of it. Thirdly, the Age of Enlightenment is not synonymous with the scientific method. Too many textbooks, frankly, both from the high school days and even from college, tend to allege that it's the scientific method that gives rise to the Enlightenment. There's a couple of issues here. First and foremost, the Enlightenment is not simply a movement within the sciences. we're going to look at one of the men who actually, in some ways, is the founder of the scientific method, Francis Bacon. But there are other movements that we equate with the Enlightenment that do not have much to do with the study of the natural world. In other words, the Enlightenment is bigger than simply the scientific revolution, though it certainly is an umbrella over which the scientific development of the European world gets going. The other thing is, there is no simple single definition of the scientific method. This idea that one idea, one method of doubt creeps in, and suddenly they apply this to the natural world, and then eventually they say, all right, let's get rid of all this faith stuff, is too simplistic an answer. In fact, ironically, the man who, in some ways, invents the scientific method was himself a devout Protestant, really more the Puritan stripe than anything else. Again, he thinks he is applying good Christian methods and principles to the idea of discovering and studying the natural world. And so he comes up with something that is like a scientific method. But there is no single descending from the sky scientific method. There had always been discussion of the appropriate measure of reason, experiment, observation, and doubt from the Greco-Roman period that was there in the Middle Ages, though it was somewhat attenuated, and then eventually it does get reintroduced here in the Enlightenment. But it's not as if one thing, one idea, or one method changed all of Europe. Again, that's too simplistic. So, to conclude from all this, again, ground clearing that we've had to do to get rid of some of our maybe preconditioned responses to what the Enlightenment is. The Enlightenment is a revolution. It's not some everyday workmanlike change to the intellectual world. These are big changes. However, those who are at the initial stages, as the Enlightenment is dawning on Europe, are unaware of either what they're changing, as it will change down the corridors of time in later centuries, or they themselves don't have the same conclusions that others will reach based on these same principles. The change is wider than merely one of science or of the shift away from the church in one direction. Rather, it's cultural, political, philosophical, etc. It goes all throughout every level of society in Europe by the time it's done. So what we have here, we're going to say, just with some round numbers, is you have from 1650 to roughly 1725, what I will call the early Enlightenment. This is the time where it is still relatively combined, the worlds of faith and theology and dogmatics, and the area of science and doubt and philosophy. These worlds have not split fully at this point. After that, though, from 1725 roughly to about 1850, and of course it carries on a bit after, you have what I will call the radical Enlightenment. And by radical here, I mean simply radical conclusions, more radical commitment to some of these earlier Enlightenment principles, not pairing and partnering with faith or the Christian worldview, but rather distancing itself and at times becoming a bit hostile to the things of faith. So this is still one continuum. This is still the Enlightenment overall. But what changes is the tone of it and the radical stance of some of those who come in the later days of the Enlightenment. It's in those later days, for example, where you do begin to see some of the tussling back and forth between the claims of science versus the claims of faith. In the early days, you really don't have much of this. You have some of it, to be sure, but it's not nearly as pronounced or as serious as it will become. So to finish up this lecture, we're going to take two examples from the 17th century, one from the realm of the sciences and one from the realm of philosophy. And we're going to demonstrate just briefly a bit from their story and a bit from their intellectual writings what it is that they thought they were doing and how, despite the fact that both of these men believe that they are devout Christians, are beginning to introduce some changes to the way that we think and do our philosophy or our study of the natural world. The two we're going to look at are Francis Bacon and René Descartes. First of all, with Francis Bacon, Bacon's dates actually coincide with the Reformation itself. 1561 to 1626, he is right there in the thick of it, with Elizabeth in England, all the way down to the dawning of the Stuart Age, with the coming of James I, and in the last year of his life, the rise of Charles I. Francis was an intellectual and a political leader on a number of different levels. In fact, William Cecil, who we've seen, Lord Burleigh, the right-hand man under Elizabeth, who himself was a committed Protestant, you might say Puritan on some level, though of course he resisted and rejected the Puritans of his own day and their conclusions on things like the vestments. But William Cecil was Francis Bacon's uncle, and actually to that end, Francis actually sees himself to the day that he dies as a committed Protestant there in Elizabethan and Stuart England. He was for a time the Attorney General, and then eventually he was Lord Chancellor of England. He eventually has a political disgrace. It is found out that he is corrupt and has accepted monies for the sake of his actions, and so therefore he is removed from office and disgraced for a period. But he had been a Cambridge man. He had gone to the university there, where he actually was a personal disciple of the man Whitgift, who would eventually become Archbishop of Canterbury and one of the leading Protestant theologians there in Elizabethan England. Now, Bacon's intellectual influence on the Enlightenment, again, is in the realm of the natural sciences or the study of the natural world. Voltaire actually says of Francis Bacon that he is, quote, the father of science. And this is due in large part to the fact that Bacon actually comes up with the closest thing that we have to a scientific method full stop. Now again, the scientific method is not a method in and of itself. It's rather a collection of methods in all different varieties that have a root core of things like observation, doubt, hypothesis, etc. Well, the method that Bacon lays out is one of these types of approaches to the sciences. It's often, in fact, sometimes called the Baconian or the Bacon method. And in it, he lays out all kinds of ways that we are supposed to doubt our senses, doubt our preconceived convictions, that we're supposed to observe things and bring nothing to the table, you might say, and then working off of intuition, come up with hypotheses, and then try to measure them, etc. And it's for this reason that you can see why Bacon is often considered to be one of the more important figures in the development of the history of science, as well as in the Enlightenment. You can see why Voltaire would look back to him as the father of modern science. Here's the thing, though. Again, just to kind of shade this just a bit, what's striking about this is the fact that Bacon, to the day that he died, saw himself really more as a theologian of the natural world than as a scientist leaving the things of faith behind. So, for example, in his book, The Great Instauration, the book that actually gives us the new method of doing scientific or natural study of the world, it's in this book, in The Great Instauration, that the Baconian thesis or the Baconian method is spelt out step by step. Here's the funny thing, though. The book itself was actually based on the Bible, at least Bacon thinks that it does. So, for example, there are 6 major subjects or chapters in the book. Bacon actually says in his preface that he has 6 because as he is a student of the natural world, as he is a student of creation, he felt that it would be appropriate to base his book on the 6 literal days of creation as he saw it. So there are 6 days and 6 chapters. And on the 7th day, he says, he rests. So in the context very much of the book that gives us, allegedly, the scientific method, or at least part of the scientific method, as it would come to be known, the book itself is more of a theological textbook. And it's not just that he arranged the book according to the 6 days of creation. Bacon actually spends time in the book coming up with what he believes is a Christian biblical account for how we can even study the natural order. You see, for Bacon, as a Protestant, he realizes that the world is tainted with sin, that we are sinful people, that there is a corruption to the created order. Well, that would seem, at least to those who are committed to the studying of the natural world, as if it somehow calls into jeopardy either the goodness of creation, therefore the reason for even studying it in the first place, or, more importantly, our ability to grasp nature and to study it with any degree of conviction. Bacon actually lays out an argument where he says that because of salvation, because of the work of Christ on the cross, we can now do science. What he means by this is the work of grace in the context of salvation restores to us and restores to creation their integrity. Not fully yet, of course. He believes that there has to be a final restoration with the coming of Christ. But he actually bases the very ability to do science on the fact that Christ has died on the cross, he is risen again, and therefore he is Lord over the cosmos. For him, that's why we study the natural world, because it is redeemed. Notice again the blending of scientific Enlightenment principles with theological and Christian biblical principles. Now, is this a good argument? Maybe. That's not the point. The point is that for Bacon, he sees himself as dovetailed, or maybe even you might say, as not having left the Reformation Protestant world. Still, though, Bacon does signal some changes in the way that he attempts to ground the process of doubt and experiment in the context of the world of his day. Bacon actually does introduce things into his scientific method that had not really been thought of before. Things like rigorous doubt, not simply taking answers at face value, not simply, for example, accepting claims about the natural world based off of things that appear to come from maybe the medieval world or something like this. So in other words, even in the context of his attempt to be a good Protestant, Bacon is, in some ways, grounding his perspective and his method on this idea that not everything is to be trusted. Now, he is not an atheist, and he's not cracking that door. In fact, Bacon, in one of his essays, actually writes a treatise against atheism. Very famous quote of his. He says, quote, "A little philosophy inclines to atheism, but depth in philosophy brings minds to religion." Now, right there again, he's saying only those who dabble in philosophy, which in his case means everything from the sciences to theology to whatever. He says those who dabble in it incline towards atheism. That's frankly pretty telling. He's saying that there are folks who seem to be injecting too much doubt because they get a little bit of this idea of doubt and then therefore they just run with it. But he's saying on the other side of that doubt, on the other side of that temptation, the siren call for atheism, you eventually get to a commitment that religion is the only way. The other thing, though, with Bacon is he's pretty scathing against those who are superstitious, those who are kind of mind-addled, faith-committed folks who simply won't measure or experiment things. Now, that will become a hallmark of the more radical Enlightenment's attack on either the church or on certain people of faith. So, again, with Bacon, he's part of this Enlightenment. He is making some leaps and jumps in, you might say, new directions. But here he is in the context of the early 17th century, believing that he is being really not much more than a philosopher theologian of the Christian and Protestant world. So there are changes afoot, but they're not fully realized here in the person of Francis Bacon. What about René Descartes? Descartes is another one of these folks. Anyone who's taken the Philosophy 101 course during their undergraduate days, or who has taken just a basic overview of Western philosophy, they always stub their toe on Descartes. In the philosophy realm, Descartes is considered to be really the breaking point from whatever has gone before to whatever comes after. It's often, in fact, called the Cartesian revolution, meaning the Descartes-Cartesian revolution. That after Descartes, you have this ultimate commitment to the question of assurance or true knowledge, not simply knowledge based on faith. Descartes' dates, of course, are 1596, and he dies, very helpfully for those trying to remember the dates, in the year 1650. He was actually born to a Roman Catholic family in an area that was controlled by the Huguenots. Most of his life in the context of his upbringing, in fact, drove into him and ingrained within him a real concern with the fact that the Catholic Protestant claims to absolute truth needed to find a grounding that was somewhat more sure than simply appealing to their own personal convictions or their own personal confessions. The deal with Descartes, though, is to the day that he died, he believed he was a devout Roman Catholic. In some ways here, though, beyond Francis Bacon, Descartes is attempting, he thinks, to live within the confines of his Catholic faith. But he goes so much further than his confines that eventually, just a generation after his death, his books are eventually banned by the Catholic Church. But it's important to note that Descartes himself was not an atheist. What Descartes is looking for, again, is a more sure foundation for building up truth claims than what had gone previously before. He thinks he is regrounding the Catholic faith on a better footing than simply shouting louder than the Protestants or imposing upon them politically their faith. The Cartesian revolution, you might say, is this. In the Middle Ages, as we've said, there were people who discussed the limits of faith and reason. The question, though, in those days was often more, what can I know? Can I know the Trinity in any deep way? Abelard or Aquinas might ask. How can my words have meaning if God is incomprehensible? How can my faith or my reason connect with who God is? Again, that's a faith and reason question. It's in the philosophy realm, it's not in the sciences, but you can't fault them for not being scientists. In the philosophy realm, they are asking pretty profound questions. In fact, Aquinas and Abelard and all these folks deal with the subject of the slipperiness of language and its inability in some cases to actually signify what you mean, that it at times feels very much 20th century and all the debates we've had over the meaning of words and language during our own time. But the question in the Middle Ages was more, what can I know? Where Descartes changes it, again, the Cartesian revolution, is he makes the question not what can I know, but how can I be certain? You see, in the Middle Ages, the question of what can I know did not rest on the claim that one can be entirely ironclad certain based on the merits of my own rational synthesis. You might say that the medievals, when they were discussing faith and reason, were like men swimming in the ocean asking, how can I grasp even some language to describe what I'm seeing? I'm seeing it, I'm observing it, I'm not blind, but I can't comprehend fully everything. Descartes is more the man that's building a house, and he's asking the question, if I can't have a rock-solid base to build anything upon, if I can't be absolutely certain of something, then I will not even begin to attempt building a house of what I think or believe. That is very subtle, to be sure, but that is the Cartesian revolution, you might say. We mentioned in a previous lecture that Descartes asked the question, how do I know anything for sure? And he comes down, somewhat anachronistically, given the slogan of it, with the phrase, I think, therefore I am. What does he mean by this? Well, again, he comes to this conclusion almost like a geometric proof. Of course, you'll remember in geometry that a geometric proof is a given. It's something that is the foundational principle that you then apply to a problem to figure something out. You don't have to prove the proof itself. It itself is a given. That's what actually Descartes is really looking for in the philosophical, intellectual world. And he lands on this claim that I think, therefore I am, as his conclusion. I can doubt everything. I can doubt that faith is a figment of my imagination. I can doubt that the pastor or the priest standing in front of me is lying to me. I can doubt that the Bible was made up by a bunch of devils and gremlins trying to convince me to believe false things. Notice, by the way, the radical paring away of confidence in some of the things that for centuries people had assumed were things you can trust. Descartes is saying, I can't, based on reason alone, trust those things because there's always some sliver of doubt that can cause me to doubt them. In the end, though, he comes down hard with this claim, I think, therefore I am, which is another way of saying, just the fact that I am doubting that I exist itself means that I have to exist to be doubting the fact that I exist. He's kind of painted himself back into this corner, and he realizes that he says, from a, again, geometric proof sense of the argument, if I'm the one doubting, then I have to exist to be doing the doubting. It can't be that I doubt and don't exist at the same time. Therefore, he says, I'm thinking, I have thoughts as a person, I must therefore assume that I couldn't be not thinking and yet thinking at the same time. Therefore, the conclusion, I think, or maybe a better translation is, the fact that I'm thinking means that I exist. Now again, Descartes' purpose here is not to get rid of Christian dogma. Rather, he believes what he's doing is grounding Christian dogma, in particular Catholic faith, off of this new principle. He believes that because we build up the question of, I know I exist, therefore from that principle I can build up a case to defend everything that I believe. And if you actually read Descartes' philosophical works, he does spend a majority of his time after he has come up with this claim that he thinks, therefore he is, trying to buttress all of his other conclusions based off of that foundation. In other words, he's not saying, all I care about is that I exist, forget everything else. Rather, he thinks he's found the foundation stone upon which he can build his house for his theology and for his Christian philosophy. Now, it's telling. Descartes, again, says that his, you might say, great forerunner in this type of debate is Anselm. Anselm had made something of an analogous argument about the existence of God. And Descartes here thinks he's doing something that is relatively in keeping with the Christian faith. He, like Bacon, also goes on to radically critique atheism as being bad philosophy and impossible. Still, though, when you look at the teachings of Descartes, this radical spin from, again, to use that analogy, people in an ocean trying to describe the great mystery of the complexity that's all around them, versus this, as we call it, Cartesian revolution, to base everything on me as the thinking, rational person, is a shift. It is a radical shift. And this is why we call it the Cartesian revolution. He's made us, and our rationalism, the foundation upon which we build certainty upon everything else. Well, it's really in Descartes, also in Bacon, but in particular in Descartes, that you see again the implications of those in these early days of the Enlightenment who are introducing new revolutionary ideas to Europe, who themselves don't follow their own implications, yet who, in the course of a future century, and as the years wear on, we can see in hindsight, we're introducing things that eventually will lead to a more radical Enlightenment perspective.